Welcome, everybody, to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. I'm your host, Redbeard, and tonight we are going to be covering war and liberty. This is kind of a continuation from the last episode that I did, which was pertaining to warfare and a lot of the different things that pertain to what all goes into declaring war, what all goes into uh, you know, Congress and all of the definitions that our founders understood, as well as a bunch of other things that go into the realm of warfare, the way that we are supposed to conduct war, and even in so much as including certain aspects of entangling alliances. And with some of these sections, we're going to be covering the 1973 War Powers Act, also known as the War Powers Resolution. But without further ado, I know that was kind of a mouthful. If you like what you see here this evening and you want to show a little bit of extra support, it would be greatly, greatly appreciated. Like, share, subscribe, send this over to people who you think might be interested in checking out the show this evening. And all of that really, really helps boost me in the algorithm and gets me out to a lot more people. And I really have to say thank you so much for everybody who's shown me the support up until this point. I know there's been kind of a little bit of a break and a little bit of a hiatus in terms of posting and doing videos, but hopefully we're starting to level off. And with, the next month or two, I should be hopefully, I say hopefully because I'm not sure what next couple of months are going to hold, but hopefully we start getting back to a little bit more of a regular program and getting more videos out. But I don't want to sacrifice, good videos or quality videos for the sake of just putting stuff out. But thank you to each and every one of you for supporting the channel. So without further ado, war and liberty. So what does all of this constitute? Well, there's a lot going on in the realm of our country, the ramifications pertaining to war. And it really seems like there's just this constant grinding along of being involved in wars and things that we don't need to be a part of, that have nothing to do with us, that really don't affect our daily lives in terms of all of these enemies abroad that they say that we're supposedly facing. And, whether you want to pick the war in Iran, whether it's the war in Ukraine, or anything else in particular places. We still see things in Syria and Somalia and so many other places. It really is becoming a kind of this drumbeat for being involved in places that ultimately we see the ramifications of taxation, stronger surveillance, and increased legislation surrounding a bunch of other things. So we're going to get into this. We're going to start breaking it down. It's going to be a little bit more of a long form type of situation, but let's get into it. So essentially, right, I'm going to have some notes here, so I'm going to read off of my notes. So just bear with me. War may sometimes be necessary, right? Because sometimes we don't get the opportunity to pick whether or not we get attacked. And sometimes if we do get attacked, or sometimes we have to defend ourselves, then war is one of those things that occurs as a result. It is necessary for the defense of a free people, but war, especially offensive, undeclared and perpetual war, is one of the greatest mechanisms for concentrating political power and destroying liberty. It's always been a very potent mechanism for that, and you'll start to see that theme as we go through. There is a question here that I think is worth posing, which: can a republic remain free while living in a permanent state of war? Hopefully, by the time we're done with this, you'll be able to have enough information to come up to your own conclusion on this. So we're going to establish a few things here and kind of formulate a direction. The issue is the political machinery created by war, right? All of these mechanisms, all of these turning gears and pieces that all kind of fit into a puzzle. What all is required for all of these things? Well, we have things like executive power, standing armies, debt and taxation. surveillance and secrecy, censorship and propaganda, emergency authority, which is one of the favorites of a ever-growing government. We do live under the largest government ever in the history of the world. And the surrender of constitutional restraint, and essentially restraints that would be vital for protecting our liberties and rights. Now, war does not remain always on a foreign battlefield, right? I mean, one could argue that we shouldn't necessarily be on really any of the foreign battlefields we find ourselves in. It eventually, however, though, does return home. The power is claimed by the government fighting it. And that is what happens is you do get these assumed powers. You do get this assumed authority. Typically it's all undelegated, and it's all just by usurpation or by a general consensus of the people that we are supposed to have elected to thwart such things, and they just roll over and abdicate their role. So I want to start with a quote here by John Madison. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. This was a quote by James Madison from Political Observations of 1795. And I think that's more true today than it ever has been. And it certainly is a very true statement through history itself. And I want to read this one more time. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. And as we go forward and as we go into these examinations and understanding the relationship of war, liberty, tyranny, and usurpation, you should be able to understand why by the end of this, that is the case. So, when we look at this, you'll start to see in these themes here that taxation, consolidation of power, surveillance, and so much more is going to factor into that. Now, the first portion of this, however, is what constitutes war. Okay. I guess you could say a question that we could pose is, what did the founding generation understand by the word war? What did that mean to them? What did they understand it by in a legal definition, or the definition that was widely understood at that point? Well, we're going to get into that. Governments frequently avoid the word, however, and especially in a contemporary sense, using terms such as a military operation, a limited strike, intervention, police action, peacekeeping missions, kinetic action, counterterrorism operation, and many, many other words in order to replace the idea of war. The constitutional nature of an action does not change merely because the government decides that it wants to change its label. It doesn't matter whether or not you want to slap on something that sounds a little less intense. It's still the same basic principle. And when we go back, and especially if I think a great resource is the 10th Amendment Center, and there's going to be a couple times that we're going to reference them, but they have a really good point here. And the 10th Amendment Center has cited the founding era understanding of war as the exercise of violence under a sovereign command against such as oppose. So essentially, to break it down to a basic understanding, it's the exercise of violence or an act of aggression from one sovereign to another. It also summarizes war further in saying any hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition, essentially breaking it down to that basic level. So there's a couple different ways that you can see how these things factor in. Now, where did they get this? Well, they got these from, de Vattel, from the Law of Nations, right? The Law of Nations is something that people who have taken time to study our founding documents, our foundation, liberty, and other things that are within that realm, they'll start to understand who Vattel is and what he tried to explain. Now, the Law of Nations principle, public war concerns the use of force by nations or sovereign political authorities. Essentially, what he goes on to say is public war is that which takes place between nations or sovereigns. Emer de Vattel, Law of Nations. So moving forward, we now have an idea of how our founders understood what war was and what was basically the agreed upon idea of what constituted war. What does war look like? How is it defined, right? At least at that point in time, and essentially what they took moving forward through our subsequent revolution and into the founding of our country, and how they ultimately used that to shape our founding documents and the way that we're supposed to be as a republic. The essential elements are sovereign authority. Okay, that's one. Organized force or violence, opposition against which that force is directed. A formal declaration is one constitutional means of recognizing or authorizing war. It is not what magically transforms violence into warfare. A better point here, or a point that I think is worth making, a war is not defined by what politicians call it. It is defined by what the government is doing. So notice in all of this, even whether it's Vattel or anybody else that at the time was understanding war and defining what war was and what became a very universal understanding of war, is a war is not simply defined by what or it's not defined by what politicians call it. It's based on the actions, and the scope of those actions. There really is no metric for those actions. It doesn't matter whether it's very grand or whether it's extremely small. All of these actions that fall within this parameter, right, which is very, very broad. It is undefined in terms of the parameter, but it's defined by the actions, fits into this realm. Now, moving forward, now that we have a basic understanding, right, of how war was defined, we're going to move into the constitutional division of war powers. The constitutional foundation, as it were, is under Article 1, Section 8. It gives Congress the power to declare war. However, Article 2 identifies the president as the commander-in-chief, right? These are separate functions, okay? They are purposefully separate functions because they did not want one branch of government to assume more power and ultimately to be the determining factor of whether or not we go to war and we pick a war with whomever we want to, whenever we want to, or wage war of choice, et cetera, et cetera. The founding era division can be seen as during the Constitutional Convention, the proposed congressional power was changed from make war to declare war, right? Madison and Elbridge Gerry supported the change in order to leave the executive with the ability to repel sudden attacks, right? So it does provide a little bit of latitude for the executive, being the president, to repel sudden attacks. But notice that it was sudden attacks, which means it is an act of defense. And the attack has to be sudden. It has to be happening, right? Let's see here. Oh, I just, there we go. Messed up my notes here. The core constitutional principle, the president commands the military forces, right? Once lawfully employed. The Congress determines whether the country will move from peace, okay, into an offensive war. So going from that sense of defense, or rightfully what should be defense, into a more aggressive war. The simple formulation, essentially, in moving forward with this is the president may repel an attack. However, Congress decides whether to initiate war. So this distinction matters for a couple things. Defense may require immediate action. Offensive war permits deliberation, or requires, I would say require is probably a better term for this. Requires deliberation. One person should not determine whether the entire nation enters a war. The power to command war is not the same as the power to commence a war, which I think is a very distinct thing that a lot of people today, especially those in elected representation, overwhelmingly tend to forget or completely ignore altogether. The exception for sudden attacks must not swallow the congressional rule. So it should not overshadow the fact that Congress alone declares war. So something moving forward that I want you all to kind of think about. When presidents initiate hostilities and ask Congress for support only afterward, has the constitutional order been reversed? I want you to think about that. Moving ahead, War as the enemy of liberty is the next section that I would like to cover. Essentially, we are going to hopefully form a philosophical center of the episode here, right? Even though that it's in the very beginning, I do want it to help continue to lay that foundation. So Madison essentially formulates a chain of consequences. He goes on to say, war is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. Okay, we're going to get a little bit more into that as we move forward. But Madison was very right about that. Anytime that we've seen war in our lifetime, whether it was yesterday, whether it was 20 years ago, whether it was 80 years ago, we've always seen debts and taxes come into force, come into fruition. And they always say, well, you know, we're doing it for the public good. We're doing it for national security concerns. We're doing it to defend our country, despite the fact that many wars that we see today, if not practically all of the wars that we see today, have nothing to do with the defense of our nation and typically are trumped up on extremely fraudulent claims, making them not only just fraudulent, but I mean, morally extremely problematic. Moving forward, essentially what we can see is the argument that Madison is trying to raise is war goes to armies, armies go to spending, spending goes into debt, debt goes into taxation, political dependency goes into concentrated power. So for instance, a really good example of this is we have war, we have a military, okay, then you have an increase in spending. What just happened not long ago? We had this push and Trump really wants a $1.5 trillion defense budget. What is the reason for that? What is the absolute reason for that? Now you could say, oh, we need it to innovate. We need it to do this. We need it to do that. One of the things that I would argue is, well, if that's the case, then why is it that countries are developing drone technology and many other technologies for nearly a third to half the amount of money that we are? And right now they're leading the front edge of warfare as it is. And if you listen to people like Douglas Macgregor and Daniel Davis and many other experts who have served in the military at high-ranking positions and know a little something about warfare, they would say that based off of what they hear and the inside information they're getting is we're pretty behind. So how do you justify even a budget like that on a very basic level when we're not even keeping up with the nations that are at war? Iran is a very good point of that. Our untouchable F-35s, one of them was downed. Okay. So that's something just to keep in mind is when we go forward, we have to remember what Madison's chain of consequences. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And then we have to kind of follow the money from there. And the centralizing and concentration of power. War creates the institutions that seldom disappear completely when the conflict ends. So we get things like the Patriot Act, for instance, which was initiated at the height or at the very beginning after 9/11 happened, right? It was something that was a result that our government decided to institute and now has been used for broad spying and surveillance on the American people. Temporary powers become permanent authorities. We definitely see this. We see every excuse under the book, and we start to see technologies used and exploited by the government in order to, again, spy and surveil the people, as well as other arbitrary measures that come into force, whether it's in the way of laws or legislation or whatever the case might be. Temporary departments become permanent bureaucracies. Temporary taxation becomes expected revenue, right? Temporary surveillance, again, becomes normal procedure. Temporary restrictions become legal precedents. And that is a very dangerous thing, as you'll start to see a lot more of those characteristics come into place, especially when it comes to precedents, because these government officials today absolutely love to cite precedents. But whenever you have something that contradicts that or refutes it, especially for the bold-faced lies that do exist, they get very defensive about it whenever you challenge them on that. Madison also has another quote that I would like to put in here. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Now, continual warfare is a very profitable situation. It's one that allows the government to maintain an iron grip on centralization, control, power, and use the excuse of national security and for your safety. And it also makes the defense industrial complex or the military industrial complex very, very rich. There's a lot of contracts that ride on perpetual warfare. There's a lot of people today that want the war in Iran to continue, and they also want to see an expedited funding and expedited sending over of munitions and weapons and stuff like that back over at a much higher to Ukraine. So war is extremely profitable for these people. And when you start to take that away from them, they get kind of cranky and crabby. And you start to see that they become very defensive. They try and explain, we can't back down. We have to stay committed. We owe it to these people. We've come that you start getting into sunk cost fallacy territory where it's like, well, we've already committed so much, so now we can't go back now. It becomes this big cycle of essentially tyranny and usurpations and violations of rights, liberty, and the like. Now, a distinction here that we can start to emphasize is Madison did not say that freedom could never be defended by force. In fact, that's not what many of the founders said. The founders were actually very much open to the idea, and they expected more or less the idea that we would have militias. We would have a system in which the general populace would be well armed, well regulated, but not regulated in the sense of laws and legislation or anything like that. At the time, the legal definition of what regulated meant as it pertained to arms, the people, and the militia was that people just were well trained, that they were capable, that they were competent. And they did not say that regulated was you need a permission slip for this, you need a license for this. The government gets to tell you essentially what arms you can have, what arms you can't have. There was a full expectation that the general populace would be as well armed and as capable as the military or the general defense force, being the expectation of a militia, right? There was no expectation to have a perpetual standing military. There was an expectation that people would be well armed. And look, it becomes one of those things that when you have a well-armed populace, what else do you get from this? You get a bulwark against tyranny. If you have a well-armed populace, the government is less likely to start to impose more arbitrary laws, legislation, restrictions, and so on the general populace, because they understand that the populace might get a little bit rowdy, and they have the ability to gather and to use those arms for their benefit and not for the government's benefit. It is a check and balance, if you will. He warned, Madison also goes on to warn that continual warfare changes the internal character of a nation. This is also very true. We have seen this with many, many other empires, and I would say, as well as many others, that I would define America today as an empire, and we have certainly seen the rise and fall of empires historically, and there's a reason that empires don't last forever, and they often come to a very violent and bloody end. Rarely do they ever just fizzle out and go into the ether. He goes on to also emphasize in many of his quotes, a republic may survive a particular defensive war. It cannot indefinitely survive war as it is a normal political condition, right? So it can't as its normal political condition, because war is extremely degrading. It degrades moral character, it degrades the wealth of a nation, it degrades many other facets of the nation or the country in which that war is stemming from, or which it is being engaged by. And it's a highly, highly destructive thing. Many of the founders and many other founding philosophers, as well as philosophers from well before the founding era, understood how destructive war is. And a lot of people love to talk about Rome. Rome is an example of that. They got huge, they waged endless wars, and eventually it came back upon the citizens and eventually was a contributing factor to the fall of Rome. Moving forward, we're going to take a look at war and executive power in the fourth portion here. Madison, once again, comes in to say war is in fact the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. And following up with that, Hamilton, who most people in the sphere as it pertains to liberty that really understands or tries to understand the Constitution and liberty and rights, understand that Hamilton was he was one of the least liked founders. A lot of people don't have a very good opinion of Hamilton because in the end of the day, he really did. He wanted to actually have a king again. He wanted to have a more strong central power, which is kind of ironic considering that we had just fought a long, bloody war to separate ourselves from that type of situation. But he even goes on to say, it is of the nature of war to increase the executive at the expense of the legislative authority. So what he's saying, and this is from Federalist number 8 by Alexander Hamilton, what he's saying is, look, it is invariable that the executive is going to consume, it is going to expand, it is going to essentially bloat itself at the expense of the legislative authority, which means it just stops caring. It's not going to be restrained. It's not going to cede any of the power that it eventually gets. And Madison backs this up by saying war is in fact the true nurse of the executive aggrandizement. So you have two guys here that are coming to the same conclusion. And this was something that was talked about amongst many other founders, especially the anti-federalists. So war naturally favors the executive because war demands many of the following: rapid decisions, unified command, secrecy, intelligence control, diplomatic maneuvering, and military obedience. These practical characteristics may be necessary during battle, but they are dangerous when allowed to redefine constitutional government. So when you have these things that breach that line, they cross the Rubicon essentially, and they start to be more encompassing and continuously growing, they do have a tendency to affect the constitutional government and redefine it as such. A few questions that we should be asking ourselves moving forward: who controls the intelligence used to justify intervention? Who declares that immediate action is necessary? Who decides what information must remain secret? Who defines victory? And furthermore, who decides when the emergency has ended, right? Frequently, the same executive branch seeking permission, okay, or bypassing permission also controls most of the information upon which the decision is based. So when you have a branch of government that is seeking permission, but at the same time, they just take that control and decide, well, it doesn't really matter what you say because we know that you're not going to enforce it again. You have a Congress that abdicates its authority, which we've seen a ton in the last year. It's just going to take control it controls most of the information upon which the decision is based, and ultimately it just makes a decision on its own. A key point here: war powers must not be judged by whether we trust the current president. They must be judged whether we are willing to grant the same powers to every future president, right? So if you have a president that says, well, I need the temporary authority, or I need to be able to do this, you're going to have left and right and the Republicans and the Democrats arguing back and forth. Well, we need it because my president needs to do this. But these people don't fundamentally understand that, okay, well, if you grant the president to do this now, then the person you don't like in the future is going to use those same powers in the future. And it just becomes this never-ending cycle of absolute chaos and warfare. And overwhelmingly, it's going to be the continued situation where Congress continues to abdicate its authority, the executive perpetually violates its parameters and its delegated authority, usurps rights, violates liberty, and so on. Now, going on to the fifth portion here, standing armies and the permanent war establishment. There was a warning by Washington, which I think was really, really good. And it was said in this farewell address: overgrown military establishments are inauspicious to liberty, which means, look, they are a threat to liberty. They don't care about liberty. They care about their ability to expand, to grow, to assume power and control and authority. And in the end of the day, when you have a military establishment, who do you think they seek to vest their time, effort, and power interest-wise? It's going to be to themselves. It's going to be in expanding themselves. Now, Washington was not hostile towards soldiers. He commanded the Continental Army, after all. His warning concerned the political power of a permanent military establishment, as did many of the founders, more specifically, especially the anti-federalists, who had raised many, many concerns and questions about this. Now, there is a distinction here, and I do want to clarify this distinction. Honoring military service, supporting legitimate defense, unquestioningly supporting every military policy, and allowing military institutions to dominate national identity and foreign policy. These are things that really came into question. These are things that really, were could have been seen as contentious, right? Now, a republic requires the ability to defend itself. There's no argument about that. But there is a difference between a military built to defend the republic and a republic reorganized to sustain a permanent military empire. What are we today? Again, people much smarter than myself, people like Scott Horton, like Daniel Davis, and many, many other great minds in the liberty sphere have all, for the most part, identified the United States as being an empire and not a republic. There's a lot that goes into that, and it's not simply just it happened overnight. It happened by a slow, grinding assumption of controlled and consolidated power. Now, there are some areas here that support this type of situation, right? Permanent overseas commitments, institutional incentives for continued conflict, right? So like the military-industrial complex, military contracting, as I just mentioned, political dependency on defense spending, again, the $1.5 trillion that goes into that, the treatment of military budgets as beyond meaningful scrutiny, which means like, oh, you don't have to worry about that. Don't criticize it. If you comes down to a point to where if you criticize it, you're unpatriotic and you don't care about the defense of this country. And again, the use of patriotism to silence constitutional criticism. Again, saying that point out loud to where if you question what we're doing, you hate the military, you hate defense, and you don't like the country. They will exploit and leverage the idea of patriotism to nullify the constitutional criticism of their actions. They want to drown it out because they know that in the end of the day, when you challenge it on its face, it is a violation of the Constitution. It is a usurpation and violation of liberty, rights, and a betrayal of the people and the expectations of our founding documents. So a key point here that I want to emphasize: defense preserves a republic. However, militarism transforms it. We saw this once again with places like Rome, the Roman Empire, and many other empires. Anytime that you build up an overbearing, overarching military and that becomes your identity, it transforms anything that was decent and meaningful and good into this militarized state. And the shadow of the former state itself, or the former republic, if you will, is dead and gone. So in number 6, how does all of this start to come home? Well, we're going to examine moving forward here how this comes home. So we're going to connect foreign issues also, foreign war, to a realm of domestic liberty, because all of this stuff always comes back home, right? So let's start with debt and taxation. Wars require enormous expenditures. This was one of the biggest reasons, and you can actually find articles or you can find sections in the anti-federalist arguments pertaining to this specifically. Wars require enormous expenditures. Even when the direct fighting ends, the country retains, right, debt repayments, veterans' obligations, expanded agencies, permanent military infrastructure, reconstruction, and occupation costs, which, if we're being honest, let's be completely honest. When's the last time you've seen the United States ever pay to help rebuild a country? In a very, very long time. One, that it's been done successfully, but two, that's been done in earnest to say, look, we destroyed everything, but now we're going to help you try and rebuild. When it comes to honesty or an earnest situation, that would be like admitting failure. And we don't have a bureaucracy and a political elite class that would ever admit that they've done anything wrong, or that would even be held responsible for a military campaign. On top of that, we have surveillance. Wartime powers are often justified as necessary to identify enemies and prevent attacks. these powers can later be redirected towards ordinary citizens. Again, if we look at things like the Patriot Act, if we look at certain intelligence apparatuses, things like Palantir, the company of Palantir, and many other private entities that are coupled and married within the federal government, and you start seeing more and more things like surveillance devices, such as now is a very hot topic, the flock cameras. And, it's like a lot of these things come out of necessity. A lot of these things come out of the need to be able to, quote unquote, well, we used it during wartime, so we can use it to curtail crime. We can use it to cut down on violent attacks or whatever the case is. Well, we only have to sift through this person's information just to make sure that they're not up to anything crazy. Well, we just have to do this because we have to make sure that there's no threat to the homeland. There's always these excuses. There's always this form of exception to the rule instead of following the rule. And war and wartime is one of the biggest catalysts to spying and the invasion of privacy on American citizens and the American people in general. And it never goes away. It becomes a permanent fixture so long as the American people, along with all of the rest of these, are willing to tolerate it. And following directly after that, we see the next portion, which is in the form of censorship and propaganda. War encourages governments to control information, shape public opinion, and portray dissent as being dangerous. Again, how dare you question the narrative? How dare you be anti-war? How dare you say anything that goes against the narrative? You are a political miscreant. You are a dissent. Heck, we've even seen this come up. You might even actually be supporting terrorism. You might be a terrorist yourself, or you might be taking the shape of an enemy. So now they can use that surveillance and they can use the dissent to these things to justify coming to your door, dragging you out of your home, and putting you indefinitely in prison with no form of charges, with no reason, no rationale, no warrant or anything like that. And if you don't believe me, it has happened. All you have to do is do a quick little search and you will be able to find a number of different situations where this is the case. They will go after you. I hate to say it, whether you agree or disagree, it is irrefutable that this even extends into nations that supposedly our government supports, up to and including like Israel and Ukraine. If you question this, you're put on somebody's list and the FBI's at your door. The criticism in conjunction with this of policy becomes confused with the betrayal of the country. Again, if we have a policy that supports a foreign country, not even just what we're doing, but a foreign country that we happen to quote unquote like, then that is enough justification for them to come to your door, ask you questions, say, hey, we saw this on the internet. Why did you say this? It turns into this whole justification of like, oh, well, we get to surveil you. We get to come to your door because we think that you are becoming an enemy or a dissent, and we don't like that. So don't do that. The militarization component of this, wartime equipment, tactics, language, and assumptions increasingly migrate to domestic government and law enforcement. We've seen a ramp up of the militarization of our law enforcement and the way that they conduct themselves. It is becoming more of a control mechanism rather than it is about public safety. And we start to see this bleed into many, many other facets, everything from local law enforcement all the way up to the FBI and many, many other larger government entities that, again, are going to be the guys that knock on your door asking why you dissented to the war or why you don't like our greatest ally. Wink, wink. Emergency government. This is something that the government has done time and time and again, over and over. Emergency government, or the idea of it's an emergency, the government begins to operate from a presumption that danger justifies authority. Oh, it's dangerous. There's an emergency. So therefore we need more, as they would say, temporary authority in order to stem the tide. And we all know what happens when it comes to temporary authority. It is always assumed in a permanent sense, especially if it is completely ignored. The citizen is then expected to explain why do you need privacy? Why do you need free expression and speech? Why is it that you need due process? What are you hiding? Freedom of association. Why is it that you want to freely associate with these people and not with these people? Why is it you don't want to deal with these people, but you want to deal with these people? Protection from surveillance. What do you have to hide? Again, what is it that you're not telling us? Why shouldn't we be surveilling you? And why don't you like that? Why don't you allow that? During normal constitutional government, which normal is really becoming quite a term these days, the state must justify its power. And I would argue it must answer to the people as to why it needs to assume more power. And, but unfortunately, this is not the case. Under permanent emergency, the citizen is increasingly expected to justify his liberty. We have to justify why we don't want to be surveilled, why we don't want to be questioned, why we are not willing to give up due process and many other forms of our liberties and our rights. So we are the ones being questioned, and the government is above question in this case. For number 7, defense versus empire. Okay, we're going to dive into this here. Reject the false choice between supporting every military intervention and opposing all national defense. This is an essential distinction here. A free people possess the natural right to defend their lives, their families, their homes, their communities, and their country. This is justifiable defense, right? But the defensive force is not the same as a preventative war, a regime change operation, nation building, permanent occupation, global policing, and military intervention in every foreign conflict. In the end of the day, legitimate defense must have an identifiable relationship to protecting the country and its people. So it must be identifiable. The fact that something bad is happening, okay, somewhere in the world does not automatically create the constitutional authority, the constitutional authority for the United States government to wage a war there. Therefore, essentially, if it's not happening to us and it's not happening here, it's not our problem. And I know that sounds crass, and I know that sounds mean, and it's like you don't ever want to see people undergo terrible things, but if it's not directly affecting us, if we are not having to defend ourselves, then it is not within our realm to be involved. Constitutional position here: support a military capable defending the republic while insisting that it remain constitutionally restrained from becoming an instrument of the empire. There was a great emphasis that the civil authority would have oversight when it came to these types of affairs as it pertained to war, right? A key point here: peace should be the ordinary condition of the republic. War should remain a terrible exception. It should not be a normalized situation. It should not be something we wade to in with a sense of casual confidence. It should be something that should be dreaded and taken with a high degree of trepidation. Liberty by example was something the founders believed in. John Quincy Adams goes on to say, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. He also warned that if America pursued foreign wars of liberation, the fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. Essentially, we should not be going out, finding enemies, creating enemies, or being involved with others against their enemies. And furthermore, that it would be a detriment to us as a people, because you would see that change, the militarization change liberty into a sense of force, a perpetual sense of force, the calmness and the confidence and the ease of which we lend ourselves to using force to answer every single question. This was a serious issue. Adams did not argue that America should be indifferent to liberty abroad. However, he distinguished between supporting liberty morally, serving as an example of liberty, trading and engaging peacefully, which was something that was huge, attempting to impose political outcomes by military force. These were all things that were distinguished, not just by him, but especially by George Washington, as asserted through his farewell address. A nation can become a self-appointed ruler of the world while losing command of its own republican character, which means if you expand into a world empire, then you destroy and cast into desolation your own identity and forgetting that you were ever what you were to begin with. America's greatest contribution to human liberty is not ruling the world, it is remaining free herself. And number 9, we're going to get into foreign entanglements, national favoritism, and the War Powers Resolution. There was a warning by Washington. George Washington warned that a republic's foreign policy must not be governed by permanent hostility toward one nation or passionate attachment to another. And I quote through George Washington's farewell address, "The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or a habitual fondness in some degrees is in some degrees a slave." Okay. Washington's concern was not simply diplomatic etiquette. Habitual hatred and favoritism distort rational judgment or national judgment. A country that has been designated a permanent enemy will have its every action interpreted as in the worst possible light, i.e., you could look at Russia, you could look at China, you could look at North Korea, Iran, all of these people that we perpetually vilify, which is extremely ironic because in Syria, we put a terrorist and a head chopper, like an actual terrorist and a head chopper, and in as the president along with the British. And now for some reason, he's a legitimate person. I mean, make sense of that, if you will. Minor disputes become provocations. Negotiation becomes appeasement. Restraint becomes weakness. War increasingly appears inevitable. Again, i.e., a very good example of this is Iran and us with Israel against Iran. And then you also have Europe along with us as it pertains to the war in Iran or the war in Ukraine, against Russia, right? So you have people in Europe, right, that are clamoring. They want this war with Russia. They are building up, or at least claiming to build up their militaries to prepare for a war with Russia. There is no negotiation here. There is no idea of sitting down with these people. They will never sit down with just the ability to talk to these to the Russians, because if it's not on their terms entirely, they're not going to deal with them. And it's a very, very dangerous situation. Unfortunately, we are dragged into this situation. So that's where you start getting that habitual hatred. Restraint becomes weakness, or at least that's how it looks. War increasingly appears inevitable. I just mentioned that because the public has been conditioned to view the other nation through permanent suspicion, right? The opposite danger exists with favored nations, so i.e. Ukraine, i.e. Israel, i.e. many others. Their misconduct is excused. Do I even have to say anything there? I think that one, especially today, I think that really kind of hits. But I'll leave that for you to decide. Their interests are confused with our own. Again, just saying, that one's kind of obvious. And their enemies gradually become our enemies. Again, need I say more? That is exactly what is happening. The republic may eventually sacrifice its own peace, prosperity, and independence. Let us look at the proposed or the proposition, for example, of merging many areas and assets of our government and our military with the Israelis. And you'll see that very abundantly, which is a massive problem. And if you ask me, it is a absolute betrayal, not only of the American people, but of the founding generation and their sacrifices. The republic may eventually, to preserve the ambitions or security policies of another government. Again, Ukraine, Israel, and many others. Flat out. Washington therefore counseled against permanent foreign attachments while allowing their temporary arrangements, that temporary arrangements might become necessary during genuine emergencies. His principle was independence of judgment not indifference towards the world. So we should have an indifferent opinion, be able to calculate these situations of our own ability, of our own accord, and not be persuaded by a habitual love or hatred for one nation or another. Favoritism and hatred as political weapons is going to be the next portion of this here, under this realm of entanglements and so forth, where political leaders frequently present foreign affairs as a moral demand for unconditional loyalty. The public is told that questioning a favored government, need I say more, amounts to supporting its enemies. Need I say more? At the same time, diplomacy with a hated government is portrayed as surrender, treason, or sympathy with tyranny. This creates a dangerous and false choice. Unconditioned support for one foreign power or presumed loyalty to the opposing power. A free republic must reject that framing. Again, independence, right? The independent ability to think. American policy should be determined by American constitutional authority, defensive necessity, justice, and the actual interests of the American people, not by emotional attachment to one foreign capital or an inherited hostility towards another. Man, imagine our diplomatic ability in actually doing something rational and better outcomes that we would have if we took that stance today. Foreign nations have their own governments, histories, rivalries, territorial disputes, and political objectives. This is a fact. Many of the places that we have interfered in, intervened in, and gotten involved in are well beyond our understanding, as they date back to over 1,000 years, well before we were ever even a twinkle in Daddy Britain's eye, right? The key point: friendship with another nation does not require submission to its foreign policy, and opposition to war does not constitute a loyalty to that nation's enemies. Clear and simple. It's pretty well understood. And this is something that the founders fundamentally understood as being a good, robust, decent diplomatic foreign policy. One that certainly created no enemies, but also did not appease even some of our best friends. Thomas Jefferson goes forth and summarized the restrained republican principle as it pertained to foreign entanglements: peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. This was not a demand, right? This was not a demand. America withdraw from trade, diplomacy, or peaceful relations. That's not at all what that was. It was a warning against commitments that transfer decisions of war and peace away from the American people and their constitutional representatives. An entanglement becomes especially dangerous when the United States is expected to enter another country's war automatically. Alliance credibility is treated as more important than congressional authorization. Foreign governments can influence when American forces are used. Politicians confuse another nation's territorial objectives with American defense. Americans are told that previous commitments eliminate the need for present debate. Questioning the alliance is treated as disloyalty. Again, you see what the theme is here, and man, does it hit home more than ever before. An alliance may provide consultation, cooperation, perhaps mutual planning, perhaps, maybe. It must not become the mechanism through which another government effectively possesses the power to place the American people at war. We must be independent in our judgment and our abilities and our decisions, not subject to that of our habitual hatred or our fondness of one nation over another. We certainly should not be subject at all to another nation's wishes, ideas, demands, or otherwise. Treaties do not, however, replace Congress. The War Powers Resolution itself states that the authority to introduce American forces into hostilities cannot be inferred from a treaty unless Congress passes implementing legislation that specifically authorizes those hostilities. That is important. A treaty commitment does not by itself transfer Congress's congressional war power to the president. It does not. An international organization or a foreign government. Under the resolution's own language, specific legislation authorization is still required. And a key point here, an alliance is not a declaration of war, and a foreign government cannot exercise Congress's constitutional authority on America's behalf. Flat out. Now, going to the War Powers Resolution of 1973, the law commonly called the War Powers Act is officially titled the War Powers Resolution. Congress enacted it in 1973 over President Richard Nixon's veto following decades of expanding presidential war making and the experience of the Vietnam War. Its declared purpose was to ensure that the collective judgment of both Congress and the president would govern the introduction and continued use of American forces in hostilities. Under Section 2C, the resolution states that the presidential power to introduce American forces into hostilities is exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, 2, a specific statutory authorization, or 3, a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. Reporting is not authorization. When forces are introduced into hostilities or circumstances indicating imminent hostilities, the president must submit a report to Congress within 48 hours. That report must explain the circumstances necessitating the action, the claimed constitutional and legislative authority, the estimated scope and duration of involvement. But filing a report does not authorize the war. Notification is not permission. Informing Congress that military force has already been initiated cannot substitute for obtaining an authorization that was constitutionally required before initiating offensive hostilities. War Powers Report tells Congress what the president has done. It does not necessarily establish that the president possessed lawful authority to do it. There is a 60-day fallacy that comes with this. And it goes without saying, but a lot of people very much question the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution. And there's a lot of people that have made arguments about that. I've talked about that, I believe, on the previous one. I personally don't see it as being a constitutional point, but some people say, well, it hopefully clarifies certain things. I digress. The 60-day fallacy, one of the most consequential political distortions of the War Powers Resolution is the claim that every president, that it gives every president an automatic 60-day license to wage war without Congress. This is not true. So it's not true. The statute does not contain a 60-day provision. Okay. Once the required report is submitted or should have been submitted, the president must terminate use of the American forces unless Congress has declared war, enacted specific authorization, extended the period by law, or become physically unable to meet because the United States was attacked. There is a requirement for Congress to act within their delegated authority, not to abdicate their authority. An additional period of no more than 30 days may be used when unavoidable military necessity requires the time to safely remove American forces. Notice the theme here. It's all about removing military forces unless Congress declares war or meets any of the other provisions or stipulations. But that is a termination deadline, as I had said, not an affirmative grant of war-making power. The resolution states expressly that nothing within it should be interpreted as granting the president any authority to introduce forces into hostilities that the president would not otherwise possess. The fallacy works like this, essentially, and I will lay this out for you. The president initiates the hostilities without prior congressional authorization. The administration submits or claims to submit a war powers notification. Officials argue continue the operation for 60 days. The statutory deadline is transformed rhetorically into permission. And furthermore, at the very last one, Congress is pressured to report a war already underway rather than deciding whether it should begin. Again, we see a lot of abdication on behalf of Congress as it pertains to this, again, which does not make it right. Okay. The Congress should first be what lawful authority allowed the president to initiate these hostilities. Okay. The question should first be, it should not merely be how many days remain before the war powers clock expires. And an offensive action, or if an offensive action was unauthorized on the first day, the passage of 10, 30, or 59 days does not cure the original constitutional defect. It does not nullify the constitutional process whatsoever. But yet again, you have an abdication, especially as it pertains to many such instances where the president and the executive just gets away with whatever they want. And Congress rolls over, not following the constitutional pathway. And a key point to all of this, the 60-day provision is a termination deadline, not a grant of 60 days of unilateral presidential power. We then move forward. A restriction turned into a permission slip. War powers resolution was intended to restrain unilateral presidential action. It was considered to emphasize the idea that Congress had this authority. Again, constitutionally, it's questionable. And in action, I would say that it's kind of dead on arrival, if you ask me. Political practice has often converted it into a procedural framework for unilateral action rather than actually being anything of substance to what it was supposed to do. Presidents initiate force, notify Congress afterward, and just trust and treat congressional inaction as practical permission, again, abdication, to continue until the deadline approaches. Congress then avoids taking responsibility. Members can then criticize or support the conflict without creating a direct vote to authorize it. Again, furthermore, abdicating their responsibility. The executive gains initiative. Congress avoids accountability. The troops are already committed, and we embark on a sunk cost war where, well, we're already in it now. So we can't look back, and we might as well just continue doing the unconstitutional thing. And who cares about what we're actually supposed to do? The public is then presented with an operation that has become politically difficult to stop because the withdrawal may, again, be portrayed as humiliation, abandonment, or defeat. Again, it's this sunk cost war built into the sunk cost fallacy form of thinking, right? We can't turn back now. How could we ever turn back now? The Congress's own constitutional annotated observes that the resolution, the Congress's own constitution annotated here observes that the resolution did little to prevent presidents from sending forces abroad without prior authorization, that the president, without prior authorization, that presidents may have frequently resisted its restrictions or reported military actions only as being consistent with the resolution. So what is the combined danger of all this, right? Well, let's take a look. Foreign favoritism and distorted war powers, reasoning reinforce with one another. A favored nation requests American military assistance. Politicians declare that alliance credibility is at stake. The opposing nation is depicted as a permanent and irredeemable enemy. The president initiates force. War powers report is submitted. The 60-day termination deadline is portrayed as presidential authorization. Congress avoids direct vote while continuing to fund the operation. And what began as another nation's conflict gradually becomes an American war without the open constitutional judgment required to place the American people in that war. Gee, I wonder what situations right now would be consistent with that. I'll let you decide. Emphasis. Now we have to explore a few questions, right? And I think they're pretty important questions. Are we defending the United States or adopting the objectives of a favored foreign government? Again, I'll leave you to decide what the current situation is on that. Has America itself been attacked? Would politicians apply the same standards if the identities of the foreign countries were reversed? I.e., if Iran was Israel and Israel was Iran, if Russia was Ukraine and Ukraine was Russia, an example. Would we apply the same standards? I don't think so. I don't think so. Furthermore, is criticism of an ally being falsely equated with support for its enemy? Has the Congress specifically authorized the hostilities? Are officials treating the war powers notification as though it were authorization? Is the 60-day deadline being used as a limit or a presidential permission slip? Does the alliance serve American peace and security, or does it make foreign conflicts automatically ours? And finally, who ultimately decides when Americans must fight? Congress, the president, an alliance bureaucracy, or a foreign government? So I want to wrap this up here and bring this all to a conclusion. There's a lot that was being put in here, and man, we covered a lot. If you come in late or you're seeing this after it's posted, I would highly recommend you go back and you check out the rest of this before you finish the end. Washington warned that habitual hatred and habitual fondness could enslave a nation's judgment. The Constitution placed the decision to enter war in Congress. The War Powers Resolution expressly denied that it created new presidential authority. These principles lead to a simple conclusion. An alliance is not a declaration of war. A report is not authorization. A withdrawal deadline is not permission. And loyalty to a foreign nation, whether expressed through favoritism or hatred, must never replace independent American judgment under the Constitution. Now we move on to Section 10. Before supporting military action, Congress and the public should ask these following questions. And perhaps there's more, but these are the ones that made sense for me to put forth. Has the United States or its people been attacked? Is there an immediate threat requiring defensive force? Has Congress debated and authorized the action? What is the lawful and defined objective? What constitutes victory? What is the expected human cost? What is the expected financial cost? What domestic powers will the government claim? What happens after the initial military objective? What precedent will this establish for future presidents? These are all very, very important questions. Asking these questions is not a form of cowardice or disloyalty. Quite to the contrary. It is the constitutional responsibility of the citizens in a republic. The burden of proof belongs to those who want to move the country from peace into war. War may sometimes be necessary for defense. That does not make constitutional restraints less important. It does not nullify them. It doesn't erase that. It makes them more important, if anything. The founders understood ambition. They understood fear, executive temptation, foreign favoritism and hostility, public manipulation, the expansion of government during emergencies, and the difficulty of recovering surrendered power. A closing quote by both Madison and Alexander Hamilton. I'll start with Madison here first. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And Hamilton goes to say, to be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. A free people must be able to say these things. Defend the country, but do not build an empire. Protect the people, but do not destroy their rights. Honor the soldier, but do not worship the state. Okay? Understand the sacrifice of the soldier. I wouldn't quite, I would even modify that a little bit. Understand the soldier. Maybe give some reverence for the sacrifice, right? I think honor perhaps is too much or perhaps too strong of a word. But then also recognize danger, but do not allow fear to become the Constitution. A nation may win its battles abroad while losing its republic at home, while losing its liberty at home, while losing its rights at home, and subjecting its people to a long train of abuses and arbitrary measures with the excuse of safety, protection, defense, etc. That is my episode for War and Liberty. I'm going to take a few minutes here to address some of the comments. I really, really appreciate everybody who has stopped out this evening to address, to comment, to like and share. If you did like this, hopefully I will continue to keep your support and to gain your support, and to work hard for your support is something that I endeavor to do. Barfel 281. There's a couple comments from you here. Break Constitution in case of emergency. Modern day fake conservatives who pretend to be constitutionalists. Absolutely. That's fantastic. That's a great comment. Nobody in a government costume fought for freedom of America in its 200 years. Yeah, man. I mean, it's crazy, man. We used to have guys who, really put action behind their beliefs in terms of liberty and rights. And it seems like very, very, very few, if any at all, are willing to back up their words. We had presidents that were on the battlefield fighting with the people that secured our nation and our liberty and our rights at that time. And now it's like there's no willingness to even be involved beyond the idea of just an arbitrary dictate that's expected to be followed. Such good comments. Thank you so much for those, Barfo. Let's see. Really appreciate the comment here, David. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate the comment as well. Really try to present the best episode I can here, especially when it's something that requires in-depth explanation and hopefully covering all of the areas that are required. So thank you. All of Congress stood up and cheered when Mango Mao Zedong threatened Iran during the State of the Onion show earlier this year. Oh man, that's yeah, dude. It's the rabidity. I don't even know if rabidity is a word. It's my word. I'm making it. It's an expansion on rabid. The rabidity or the rabid nature of Congress. Just a warmongering is just insane, and the expense that they're willing to put forth. It's just mind-blowing, man. And it's never going to be any of their kids. It's never going to be anybody in Congress. Yeah, sure, you have some people, it's like I'll put it this way. Anybody in Congress who served in the military that understands fundamentally the cost, you would expect these people to be mature enough to be like, you know what we don't want to do? Send other people's sons and daughters to go die for a stupid, pointless war that we shouldn't be involved in to begin with. That you would think that would be the proper position, but no, you know what? And quite frankly, it's like, if you like war that much, why did you get out of the military? Why did you even come to Congress? Go stain your hands with more blood. I don't know, dude. You know, like, Congress is not the right place for you if that's the way that you feel. You know, people can disagree with me on that, but I just did a whole show tonight about war and liberty, and you can clearly see what the costs are. Another one by El Barfo. Congress does not want to do its job, so they can just blame a president and not face consequences for their unconstitutional surrender of their authority to the executive. Yeah, no, I mean, look, again, it's the abdication of authority. They don't want the finger pointed at them. And in the end of the day, unfortunately, what that leaves is carte blanche for the executive to be like, well, Congress abdicated their authority, or they never said I couldn't do it. So you get this pissing match between the legislative or Congress and the executive, pointing the finger and blaming each other. And it's just, it's all just, you know, it's all just one big show. It's insane. And this is another great one by you, Barfo. There is no in case of emergency violate the Constitution provision that was established by the founders or framers. That is exactly true. Exactly true. And to follow up, the media helps perpetuate government lies. Beware the government media complex. Absolutely. I couldn't have said that better myself. And you know, this, and I can't say this enough. Look up the 10th Amendment Center for historical context. On 95% of what the government does is on dude. They are one of my favorite places to go for information. If you guys and gals haven't checked them out, I highly recommend you go check out the 10th Amendment Center. They do amazing work over there, and they have some really, really good people. I can't speak highly enough about them. So that's a great point. And just to reiterate with this, the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. Look, I mean, I 100% take your side. There's a lot of people that feel like, well, you know, it's like, no, I don't buy that it's constitutional. To me, it doesn't really do anything. It's dead on arrival, and that's how it's been treated. Yeah, no, we don't do idol worship or presidential worship here. So you know, that's something I've made clear. It doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Biden or Obama or whatever. I don't care. I will criticize whomever and wherever where it makes sense. So in the end of the day, look, I'm going to call it out how I see it, and I use the Constitution and founding documents, and I use many other great works of liberty and rights to help try and guide the way that I assess these things, and I use the past, and I look at what history tells us as well. And so I'm here to say that you know, if people like Trump, if they don't like Trump, that's irrelevant to me. I just go based off of liberty, rights, and you know, what the Constitution, our founding documents, not just the Constitution, but our founding documents and the arguments and all of these different things. I go by that. I tend to find that tends to be the most consistent guide overall. So let's see. Yes, it's one big DNC RNC leftist party puts out a show like the WWE. FDR even said it. It happens. If it happens in politics, you can bet that it was planned that way. that's that's pretty good. I like that. That's good. So, yeah, man. Yeah, absolutely. I just figured I'd put that out there just for those who might wonder. So I do appreciate the comments. It really, really means a lot. Thank you for that. And in closing, thank you to each and every one of you. I really appreciate everybody who stops by to see this, who takes the time out of their day. I know this was a little bit of a longer one, but I really wanted to try and be as thorough as I could be, especially with it being a follow-up of the very first one that I did. I hope each and every one of you got something out of this video tonight, and hopefully you walk away a little bit more informed, and in the very least that it gets you to evaluate things a little bit differently, that it maybe gets you to kind of question things a little bit more. That is, I would say, if anything, whether we agree or disagree, hopefully there was a little bit of thought-provoking there. And, as always, you're welcome to make your own decisions or come to your own conclusions. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. So as always, leave any comments that you weren't able to down below. If you see this after it's uploaded, I would love to see comments, questions, etc. And I will do the very best that I can to address those when I'm able to. Fortunately, I don't do this as a profession. I have no sponsors. I take no money. I don't monetize any of this. I do this because liberty is a passion of mine. Rights is a passion of mine. And I really, really want to keep it that way, unfettered. So then that way it is as authentic as it possibly can be. And, that's how I felt when I first started this. And that's how I feel today. And I intend to keep it that way, where liberty comes first, and I do not compromise on my principles whatsoever. So thank you. Have a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you guys and gals. I believe it's going to be the 25th. I'm going to be having a guest on, so be on the lookout for that. And as always, carry that flame of liberty with you wherever you go, and be relentless in your pursuit of expanding liberty, of maintaining and defending your rights, and hopefully keeping some semblance of the republic alive in your hearts. Take care and have a good one.